What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel for another episode of the Ask Me Anything series. I do want to apologize for the lack of uploads over the past few days on both channels. I just needed a couple of days to recharge after we had those insanely busy few weeks leading up to the trade deadline. With all the recent player movement and us now being in that final push for the playoffs, there should be no shortage of things to talk about. You guys asked a ton of great questions this week, so I do want to thank every single one of you who took the time to come up with a question and leave it on the post. Even the questions that don't get featured in the video, just know I read every single one. I appreciate you all so much. You guys make the series so much fun for me to do. With that all being said, let's go ahead and get started with the first question from Luke FYB, who says, do you think lack of playoff experience is as big of a factor as some people make it out to be when new inexperienced teams make the playoffs? I really think it all depends. Like, say if there was a series and if it was still this kind of playoff format, if it was a 1 versus 8 seed, and for an example, the 1 seed was an inexperienced team that had a great year and really just broke out, and the 8 seed was a more veteran playoff experienced team, I don't think in that particular situation it would make all that much of a difference, because in most cases the 1 seed is a much better team than the 8 seed. But for an example, let's say there was 2 really evenly matched teams playing, one a lot more experienced and playoff tested than the other, and it was game 7 tied going into the 3rd period. I think it could play a big factor in that 3rd period potentially. So again, I do feel like it all kind of depends on the situation. The next question we have comes from Zora, who says, with Philip Gustafson playing well and Marc-Andre Fleury having a down season, who should start for the Wild during the playoffs? And also really appreciate the support. I'm a big believer in riding the hot hand, especially when it comes to goaltenders, because they can be so streaky. If the playoffs started tomorrow, without a doubt 100% Philip Gustafson has to be the game 1 starter. He's having an unbelievable season. If the sample size was bigger, had he played more games, he could be in the Vezina conversation right now based off of his stats. I feel like this was actually a really good follow-up question to the one we started off the episode with, because I'm sure that a lot of people, a lot of teams would be tempted to start Marc-Andre Fleury in game 1 no matter what because of his experience. He's obviously played a ton of playoff games, has won a Stanley Cup, and Philip Gustafson, on the other hand, has not started a single playoff game in his NHL career. But like I said, if the playoffs started tomorrow, Gustafson would be my guy. He's just been way too good not to be, and it's not like Marc-Andre Fleury has also been very good and has similar numbers to Philip Gustafson. I would say Fleury's season as a whole has been pretty subpar, so that would definitely make the decision a lot easier. Moving along now, this next question comes from WW Hockey, who says, which trade deadline or a few days before acquisition could you see as being a major steal? My thought was that the Vrana trade could turn out well for St. Louis, and really appreciate the support. I am right there with you. I believe I said something along the lines of that the Vrana trade could be the biggest steal of the deadline and the weeks leading up to it when I made my trade deadline review and broke down that trade. When you consider the fact that the St. Louis Blues gave up basically nothing for Vrana and they got him at 50% retained, there's just so much upside for them when it comes to this trade. When Jacob Vrana is healthy and at his best, he's among the league's most lethal 5-on-5 goal scorers. Now, yes, this season has been very rough for Jacob Vrana, and currently he isn't at his best, but just look at how he finished out last season after returning from shoulder surgery. He scored 13 goals in the Red Wings' final 26 games of the season. That is a 41 goal pace across a full 82 game schedule. It's not like it's been 2 or 3 years since Jacob Vrana has been good. This time last year, he was in the Red Wings lineup and he was producing very efficiently. If Jacob Vrana can get back to that level, or even like 80% of that, this is a massive steal for the Blues. It would give them a very valuable asset, because not only is Jacob Vrana 27 and a guy you could consider extending and keeping around as part of your core, but also could you imagine if Vrana finishes out this season really strong in St. Louis, has a good first half to next season, this is a guy that you could probably get a king's ransom for at next year's trade deadline, because again, the Blues have him at 50% retained, which is like a little over $2.5 million or something along the lines of that, and then the Blues could also retain 50% of that next year. Imagine getting Vrana for $1.3 million, especially if he gets back to playing like we saw him play in his first 40 some odd games with the Red Wings. In my opinion, this is really just a can't lose trade for the St. Louis Blues. Even if it doesn't work out, again, they gave up pretty much nothing to bring him in. Moving on now, this next question comes from Eric Hallett, who says, a lot of people had Montreal pegged as a very active team leading up to and on deadline day, but they were surprisingly quiet. Do you think Hughes was having trouble moving out some of his bigger pieces, or is he waiting until draft day / off season to do most of his work? And really appreciate the support. I really just think it boils down to the Montreal Canadiens were in a position as to where they didn't have much to do. obviously, given the current state of the team, they're not going to be buyers. And when it comes to the Montreal Canadiens selling, they just didn't have a lot of veterans on the roster who were pending UFAs, and those are the easiest players to trade at the deadline. Obviously, one of the moves they did make was trading a pending UFA in Dadonov to the Dallas Stars for Gurionov, which was a move I actually liked for Montreal, getting a guy in Gurionov who's kind of a reclamation project. Can you get him back to that 20-goal level he was at a few years ago? Another thing that probably threw a wrench in Montreal's deadline plans was the injury to Sean Monahan, who actually got off to a really good start to his season in Montreal. He's a player that I think in the final year of his deal was going to get a lot of interest at the deadline, but of course his injury changed that. It was reported that there was a good amount of interest in Joel Edmondson, but I honestly think it makes sense for Kent Hughes to hold on to him if he didn't get an offer he liked, because you'll probably be able to get more for him at next year's trade deadline, given that'll be the final year of his deal and you can retain 50% of his salary, which makes him a lot more easier to take on. I think Edmondson at 3.5 mil is a little bit overpaid for what he brings, so again, I think Montreal should probably be able to get more for him at next year's deadline. I really just think, again, it came down to Kent Hughes not really being in a position to do anything that made a whole lot of sense. The next question we have comes from Jose, who says, what's your opinion on the Pasta extension? I think it is a fair deal for what he's shown, but if they did it earlier in the season, they could have gotten him way cheaper. In the offseason, it was rumored that it could have been around 10 to 10.5. And also really appreciate the support. I think it's a fair deal as well. Yeah, maybe they could have got him for a mil and a half cheaper in the offseason, but it is what it is. Also, just for those of you who don't know, David Pasternak's extension is 8 years, 90 million, so 11.25 mil a season. David Pastrnak is not only just one of the best wingers in the NHL, he's one of the best players. He is a true superstar, a true game breaker, and the cap is set to go up a lot over the next 8 years. In years like 3-4 of this deal, the cap's probably going to be a lot higher than what it is now. This contract won't take up as much of a percentage of the cap as it does now, so I really don't see a scenario where this contract ever becomes a problem for the Boston Bruins, or it is ever viewed as a bad deal or he's overpaid. When it comes to the true superstars in the NHL, the best of the best who have been playing at this level for as long as David Pastrnak has, I don't think there's much risk at all giving them this kind of money. The only risk really is injury, and I mean, that's a risk when it comes to signing anybody to any contract. Continuing on now, this next question comes from Gibby, who says, which teams are you surprised that kept quiet leading up to the deadline? And also really appreciate the kind words. There was definitely a lot of talk about the Carolina Hurricanes and them not being all that active, but it's clear that the front office is content with the roster that they have, and the couple of moves they did make, getting guys like Puljujarvi and Gostisbehere, I actually like. Gostisbehere has already looked really good for the Hurricanes, but it just doesn't seem like they did much compared to what all of the other top teams in the Eastern Conference did. Another team I have to mention would definitely be the Colorado Avalanche. Yeah, they added some center depth, getting a guy like Lars Eller, but I think they overpaid a little bit for Lars Eller given what he is at this point in his career, and they really didn't do much else other than that. This is a team that still owns their next 3 first-round draft picks, and you look at how teams like the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Tampa Bay Lightning are just throwing out first-round draft picks to really improve their team left, right, and center. It's kind of surprising that the team looking to defend their Stanley Cup championship in Colorado didn't look to do more. So I would say Colorado would be my answer there. Next up, this question comes from MR2 Slick, who says, out of all the big name players, which player do you think actually re-signs with the new team they are on? And also really appreciate the kind words. One that immediately jumps in my mind is Timo Meier, but that's an obvious one. He's an RFA and not a UFA. But of the UFAs, somebody like Tyler Bertuzzi, I could definitely see him re-signing in Boston. He just seems like the perfect Bruin. He's already fit in very nicely. The fan base loves him. It looks like the team loves him and has embraced him. So I would not be shocked at all to see Tyler Bertuzzi sign an extension with the Boston Bruins in the offseason. Another one is Patrick Kane in New York, only because of how much he wanted to go there and how that was the only team he'd be willing to waive his no-move clause to get dealt to. Thing is, not really sure how the Rangers would make that work because of their cap situation, but just because of how much Patrick Kane wanted to be there, I feel like he should be mentioned. Moving along now, this question comes from Hugh Barkhurst, who says, is Tampa's recent play, which even led to their top players getting benched, a cause for concern, or is it still simply the case that so long as they make the playoffs, that's when they'll be off and running? I'm really not all that concerned with the Lightning. Yeah, they're in a slump right now, and even the game after their top players got benched, everyone expected them to respond with a big win. They got blown out 6-0 by the Hurricanes, became, I believe, the first team this season to finish an entire period without getting a shot on net. It's definitely been ugly lately, but I've said this before, I'll say it again. I feel like it's probably very difficult for those guys to get up for regular season games. They've made it to 3 straight Stanley Cup finals, obviously won 2 of those. They know they're going to make the playoffs. I honestly feel like that's a team that is kind of just coasting at this point, and like you said, once the playoff starts, they'll be off and running, and that's when they're really at their best. Next up, this question comes from Deltago, who says, Eastern Conference Wildcard Race, what are the last 2 teams standing? Honestly, I'm going to go with the Ottawa Senators and the Buffalo Sabres. I feel like those are the 2 most fun options of all the teams competing for those wildcard spots, of course, unless you're a fan of one of the other teams. I'm a Red Wings fan, but I've kind of accepted the fact at this point that it's not going to happen. I just think those 2 teams are super fun to watch in Buffalo and Ottawa, and I think both would be amazing stories. Obviously, it's been so long since Buffalo has made the playoffs that fan base is just dying to watch some playoff hockey. And when it comes to the Ottawa Senators, like a month and a half ago, it didn't look like they would have any chance at all to even really be a threat to get one of those wildcard spots, and here they are. They added Jacob Chychrun, the fan base is hot right now, and they're getting Josh Norris back eventually. So again, if it's not going to be Detroit getting one of those spots, which I've came to accept the fact that it's not going to be this season, those are the 2 teams I'm pulling for. And now for the final question of this week's episode. This one comes from Ryan Plunkett Hockey, who says, who do you think had the best and worst trade of the deadline and why? Obviously, honorable mention for the best to the Jacob Vrana one. I think that has the potential to be the biggest steal for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. I'm still really big on the Timo Meier deal that the Devils were able to pull off without giving up one of Mercer, Holtz, Seamus Casey, Simon Nemeth, or Luke Hughes. I think that's crazy still. The Boston Bruins adding Orlov and Hathaway is another really good one. One of my friends texted me and said, why did Dmitry Orlov turn into Bobby Orr when he got to Boston? Man, has he been lights out for them. Another really good one that I liked at the time, and it's aged very well in the small sample size so far. Rasmus Sandin going to Washington. Sure, they gave up a first-round draft pick, but it wasn't their own first-round draft pick. It was the one that they got in the Orlov Hathaway deal, and Sandin has been a beast for them in the few games he's played. That's a guy who I think is going to be a very steady defenseman in their top 4 for a very long time. As far as the worst, obviously I have to bring up the Tanner Jeannot trade just because of the kind of season he's having, but I've since changed my opinions on it a little. Yeah, they gave up a ton to bring him in, and I know one of the arguments was, well, if you're going to give up that much, you could probably get a much better player, but all those much better players likely had very high cap hits. Tanner Jeannot makes just $800K this season. I'm sure that's a big reason why the price was high, especially for Tampa, so I can see why they made that trade, and Julien Brisebois' reasoning made sense, but I still think value-wise it was pretty lopsided. Another one, I love Filip Hronek. I think he's going to be a good player for Vancouver, but just I don't think a team in their position should have been even considering trading, a first-round draft pick and a second. I know the first wasn't their own, and it's the Islanders one that they got in the Bo Horvat trade, but there's still potential for that Islanders pick to be pretty valuable. The Vancouver Canucks are a team that I definitely think could have used 2 draft picks in the first round of this upcoming draft, and that second rounder is going to be an early second as well, so I just don't really know what Vancouver is doing. And one last trade that I'll mention, the Jacob Chychrun trade, I just still can't really believe that they didn't get more for Chychrun considering how long and drawn out the process of him getting traded was. What Arizona was able to fetch for Jacob Chychrun isn't all that much more than what Detroit got for Filip Hronek, which is crazy. So that is going to wrap up this week's episode of the Ask Me Anything series. Again, like I said at the beginning, huge thank you to all of you for the awesome questions this week. I do once again want to give a big thank you to you guys for all the support you showed on the trade breakdown videos over the past couple of weeks leading up to the trade deadline. It was an awesome month for the channel. If you guys enjoyed this episode and you want another one next week, be sure to drop a like. That's the best way to show your support. And lastly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you all soon.